Hello and welcome to this training session on Conforming with Animark's Livestock Global Assurance Program, or LGAP. We will work through how to conform with LGAP in a series of sections. This training is designed to provide operators and facilities with the detail necessary to understand how a feedlot, farm, depot or abattoir would meet the requirements under LGAP to achieve and maintain certification. These requirements are grouped for today's training into personnel, environment, infrastructure and equipment, animal identification, health and management, managing transport, slaughter and processing, and monitoring. In section 7, we'll discover the requirements around having a management system, which is required by all operators and facilities under LGAP. And the final section will cover off the chain of custody requirements for importers and exporters. To start, I would like to explain how the requirements under LGAP work. Requirements are specified in the 4 LGAP standards, which detail the outcomes that you need to meet in order to be certified. There are 4 standards, which are LGAP 1000, which is a dictionary of terms, definitions, and overarching principles. LGAP 1001, the requirements for animal welfare and management, detail the requirements to handle and manage animal welfare. LGAP 1002 is a standard about the management system requirements for all operators and facilities, and LGAP 1003 is the operators' requirements for chain of custody. The application of the 4 LGAP standards depends upon what type of activities you undertake. LGAP 1001 is just a dictionary and terms and definitions. So this table shows us 1001, 1002, and 1003. So feedlots, depots, and abattoirs must adhere to 1001 and 1002. Importers must adhere to all 3 standards shown. Exporters must adhere to 1002 and 1003. It's also key to remember that within the standards, not all of the requirements apply to every type of facility or operator. There are 3 levels of certification under LGAP, which recognises that facilities around the world are at varying levels of development. Levels provide an opportunity to include all livestock under LGAP, regardless of their origin. Facility levels under LGAP are based on practices relating to livestock management, including the method of identification used, the types of restraint, and the use of stunning. Level 1 reflects the guidance provided in the OIE, and certification against Level 1 can be sought for local livestock being handled by facilities. Level 2 is considered SCAS equivalent, and all livestock from Australia must be managed through facilities that are certified to our minimum Level 2. Level 3 provides a pathway for all participants in the program to achieve higher standards through the attainment of world's best practice. The requirements in the LGAP standards focuses on animal welfare, husbandry and management outcomes. It also focuses on traceability to ensure all livestock exported from Australia are managed in a way that meets those requirements. Livestock management and traceability outcomes will be influenced by the physical elements of each site and how each site is managed. One of the enablers of continual improvement under LGAP is the documentation by operators and facilities of their own processes, procedures and practices, and the following of those documented procedures and practices by the personnel on site. Ongoingly reviewing and updating these procedures and processes and making sure they're followed, as well as keeping records to verify the outcomes of those procedures, is important. This is why LGAP requires a management system, and we'll get to that later on. But first, let's step into the requirements for sites to conform with LGAP. In each of the following sections, we'll step out what must be met in order to conform with LGAP certification requirements. The first section we're going to look at is the requirements for personnel, the environment, infrastructure and equipment that are required to conform with LGAP, and this relates to facilities, so feedlots, farms, abattoirs, and importers that might handle animals. These are key. Two of the main ways to ensure good animal welfare, husbandry, and management outcomes is to have trained, skilled personnel handling livestock and having the appropriate and safe infrastructure and equipment to do so. Let's firstly talk about personnel and training. A key element for every site is making sure it has enough people to do the jobs required. Personnel at a site must be competent, meaning they have the knowledge and skills to do the jobs required to be done. A site needs to determine if further training for their personnel is required, and if so, ensure personnel receive that training before handling animals. Training should cover the skills required and specific procedures to be followed at a site. This should include training in any emergency plans and to ensure that livestock management or traceability outcomes can be met. Critically, someone must be identified as responsible for monitoring, animal identification and welfare, and managing those animals on site, as well as verifying any records. The person or people who do this responsibility may change each day, but wherever livestock on site, it needs to be clear who's responsible. Moving on to environment, infrastructure and equipment, or what we term the physical side. So we've grouped together these requirements as they're all interrelated. Firstly, it's obvious and vital that infrastructure and equipment should be in good repair and working order. It needs to be inspected regularly to make sure that it's maintained and required. Maintenance records need to be kept. Infrastructure and equipment for loading, unloading, and handling animals should prevent the animals escaping or injuring themselves. Any traceability infrastructure and equipment at a site should be at critical control points. So if you use scanners for RFIDs or electronic identification tag scanning, they need to be present where they need to be scanned in or scanned out, as an example. A key element of ensuring good livestock management outcomes is the planning for emergencies or contingencies. So LGAP also requires that equipment required for backup at critical operations is reasonably available in foreseeable emergency situations. In order to protect livestock, sites need to be secure. So keeping animals safe from escape or predation is equally important. Sites should minimize the exposure of livestock to adverse environmental conditions such as floods or extreme weather, such as extreme heat. Sites should be safe for livestock and for staff, and need to be protecting livestock from electrical shock with appropriate and safe locations for electrical wires and the safe storage of materials that might be toxic to animals, such as cleaning chemicals. In general, pens, ramps, raceways, and restraint areas should be safe, have non-slip surfaces, and be cleaned as required. Lighting must be adequate to allow for the visual inspection of livestock and also allow for the safe and calm movement of animals. Pens or holding areas must allow animals to stand up, lie down, and turn around at all times. We have noted that equipment used each day should be maintained. In particular for abattoirs that use stunning equipment, it should be cleaned each day it's used and maintained regularly to ensure it's in working condition. The next section will look at the requirements related to identification of animals, animal health and management, including the recording of livestock movements within and between sites. Again, the focus of this section is addressing livestock management and traceability. These elements apply to feedlots, depots, and farms, but also apply to abattoirs as animals are received there and may be held there prior to slaughter. Animal identification, health, and management have been grouped together as these areas do overlap. It is helpful to think of these requirements falling into these three broad categories. Firstly, animals must be identified as animal health requirement methods of animal identification must not be toxic to animals and not present a food safety risk. Animals must be checked for identification on arrival, when they're within a site, and upon leaving. Records of animals arriving should be checked for errors against the animals actually received, and those errors should be reported to the supplier of the animals and the errors resolved. A critical requirement of LGAP is that animal identification information and associated documented information required to assist traceability must be available to animal owners, supply chain partners, suppliers, customers, Animark, or anyone Animark nominates, so accurate records of animal identification must be kept. In relation to identification, it should be noted that LGAP permits group identification with a physical identifier for sheep and goats certified to level 2. Group identification with a physical identifier could include an ear tag of a particular size, shape, or colour, a particular brand or mark, or a distinguishing physical characteristic of these species that is applied to that group of animals. Level 2 certification requires cattle and buffalo to have individual unique identifiers. LGAP uses the terminology individual unique identifier, meaning a physical tag, barcode, identification device, or other item that individually and uniquely identifies animals. Identification device is defined to mean a radio frequency or electronic identification mechanism used to identify animals. To ensure the accurate identification of animals, LGAP requires that any new or unused unique or physical identifiers should be kept secure and that records should be kept of their use on sites. We need to allow for the fact that identification such as ear tags may be lost. LGAP requires that missing identification should be replaced and records of the replacement kept. Individual unique identifiers should only be removed from live animals for health or welfare reasons, or if it's at risk of coming out. Records should be kept of the replacements used, and any found or removed unique identifiers should be recorded in a register. These must not be reused, and they must be either destroyed or, if required, returned to the owner so they can reconcile. Inspections of animals plays a critical role in ensuring animal health and welfare outcomes are met. Animals must be inspected on arrival to facilities, then every day they are held to assess their health and welfare. Animals must also be inspected before leaving a site to be assessed that they are fit to travel. This must be done by a competent person. If animals are held in lairage for longer than 12 hours, they may be inspected twice a day. General animal health at each site should be guided by veterinary advice, and any sick or injured animal should receive appropriate treatment. Animal treatments should be given by trained people following labels and instructions. Records of livestock inspections must be kept. These records should be kept of animals moved for health and welfare reasons, including illnesses and injuries, and need to include things such as identification, treatments given, and any withholding periods of medicines administered. Records of deaths and any required destruction of animals should also be kept to enable reconciliation and traceability of animals. The feed and water available to livestock can impact animal health relatively quickly. Daily inspections should check for feed and feeding behaviour, where feeding behaviour can be indicative of problems with the feed or animal well-being. Feed should be palatable and free from contaminants. Animals held over 12 hours should be fed. In general, all animals should be fed at least once every 24 hours. Animals should also have access to clean, palatable water at all times when being held. Management of a site should consider what backup arrangements need to be in place to provide feed and water should it be required, and these backup systems should be available. Animal handling is an important area to ensure animals' safety as well as avoiding injury to personnel. Animals should be handled and moved calmly and quietly using only acceptable practices. Grouping of animals should be planned to avoid mixing groups that may result in injuries. Animals should not be isolated unless required for treatment. Electric goads can be an effective tool where required, but can cause harm and distress to animals if used inappropriately. Electric goads should only be used by trained people, and they should only be used on adult cattle and buffalo. They can only be used when animals are refusing to move and where they have room to move. They should not be applied to anywhere but the hind quarter of an animal, not repeatedly on the same animal, and definitely never on the sensitive parts of an animal. Records of livestock movement are a critical component of traceability under LGAP. Sites must keep records of animal movements into and out of the site, which details all animals, including their identification, the number of animals, the dates, and where the livestock came from, or went to. Noting that some sites will manage LGAP and non-LGAP livestock, they need to be able to distinguish between different groups of LGAP and non-LGAP animals so that LGAP animals are managed in accordance with the certification requirements. Upon request, livestock movement information and associated documented information must be provided to livestock owners, supply chain partners, suppliers, customers, Animark, or anyone Animark nominates, so accurate records of livestock movements must be kept. As noted earlier, traceability is a foundation element of LGAP. If animals are missing, the site should initially do all it can to locate the animals, and if causes that led to the animals going missing are found, these should be fixed. Sites should report suspected thefts to appropriate authorities and notify relevant supply chain partners and keep records including identification details of any missing livestock. This section covers the transport of livestock between importers and facilities in market. The operator or facility that arranges the transport must have documented information including the planning of transport, or what's called a transport plan, and a list of approved transport operators. We'll look at both of these in more detail, but to be clear, the obligations under LGAP in relation to transport are placed on the operator or facility that arranges the transport, regardless if the ownership of the animals changes during the journey. Transport of livestock includes transport by road, rail, and if a vehicle boards a vessel in market. Transport relates to the journey of an animal from the consigning location to the final receiving destination, which may include short stops of no more than 48 hours along the way. When transporting animals, there must be a documented transport plan which includes the type of livestock and the vehicles to be used. It also needs to include the duration of the planned journey and allow for rest stops if needed, factoring in climatic conditions, road conditions, border requirements, and plan for emergency events and contingencies in case the journey is disrupted. It should also include how sick or injured animals will be managed en route. There must be a documented, prepared consignment. There must be a documentation prepared and kept for each consignment to assist with traceability, and those documents need to go with the animals being transported. Outside of those requirements, the transport of livestock must also ensure that LGAP certified and non-LGAP certified animals are physically segregated, and non-LGAP animals must be clearly visually identified during transport with the method of that identification noted on the transport documents. Records of death in transit must also be kept. The operator or facility arranging transport must have a list of approved transport operators. Before we look at the requirements to keep a list, we will cover the requirements of an approved transport operator. So notably, these requirements are set out in Annex B of LGAP 1001 and include having skilled drivers and animal handlers that can effectively respond and manage animal welfare during transport and during emergencies. This includes making sure that personnel are competent to humanely destroy animals if necessary. Safe infrastructure and equipment such as crates and stalls on vehicles to avoid injury to livestock is also required. Crates that allow for animals to stand in a natural position, not be overcrowded, be adequately ventilated while providing protection from adverse weather is also needed. Flooring on vehicles that is non-slip is also important. Provisions need to be in place to ensure animal identification and animal health requirements are met and that animals are handled appropriately at all times. Consignment documentation showing the required livestock identification and journey details is also needed. The information in Annex B can actually be printed and provided to transport operators so they are clear on what their obligations are. As stated earlier, the operator or facility that arranges the transport of livestock has to have a list of approved transport operators. The list itself is how the operator or facility will demonstrate conformity with the requirement. The creation and maintenance of the list requires the operator or facility to firstly assess the transport operators, so that could be trucking companies or individual trucks and drivers, against the requirements in Annex B. You can then create a list of operators who meet those requirements, and then you continue to assess those operators to ensure they continue to meet the requirements. You should also update the list regularly to make sure it's current. To assist in this, Annie and Mark have created a simple template which is available for you to document approved transport operators. It's not required to be kept in this template, but it's just available as one form. This next section contains requirements regarding the slaughter and processing of livestock under LGAP. The key elements are restraint, stunning, if it's being used, and slaughter. The objective of all requirements related to restraint, stunning, and slaughter is the humane and effective slaughter of animals. To achieve this, the requirements under LGAP include that animals be restrained for stunning or slaughter by approved methods. Animals must not be left individually restrained or in raceways during any delays or while breaks are taken. Once restrained, animals should be stunned or slaughtered without delay. When animals are stunned, animals must be stunned using an approved method. When animals are stunned, an equivalent backup stunning device must be available in case the primary stun device fails. If the first stun is not effective, the animal must be re-stunned immediately with the backup device if the primary stunner has not worked. Slaughter needs to occur without delay following stunning or the taking hold of restraint. Slaughter using an adequate and sharp knife should be a single cut of the throat, cutting both carotid arteries, or when animals are stunned, thoracic sticking can be used. When animals are not stunned, slaughter should ensure both carotid arteries are completely cut and there is a strong blood flow. A subsequent cut should be made immediately if the first cut does not result in sufficient blood flow. The head should be kept extended and the animal not disturbed until unconsciousness is confirmed. The animal should be confirmed as unconscious before it's released from restraint or moved or hoisted and the animal must be confirmed as dead before dressing procedures start. If female animals are found to be pregnant at the abattoir, they should be handled separately, and the fetus not removed before 5 minutes after the slaughter. If the fetus is alive, it should be prevented from breathing. This section is on the requirements of science to monitor and keep records associated with the monitoring of specific livestock handling activities or tasks. So what is monitoring, and why does LGAP, and by way SCAS, require it? Under LGAP, monitoring is defined as the observation of a specified critical control point, event, or situation in order to verify conformity to a requirement. Monitoring should occur each time a designated animal handling activity is completed. Monitoring is undertaken to ensure that procedures are appropriate, to verify that the procedures are being followed, and to detect any problems and issues before they escalate. Observing or monitoring animal handling activities is a key component of LGAP, as it verifies that the infrastructure is safe and in working order, and the animals are being handled in a calm and effective manner. Monitoring supports the overall principle of livestock management. I would like to point out that monitoring is different to auditing. Monitoring is undertaken by the site systematically during an activity, while auditing is undertaken at intervals. Monitoring requires someone to watch the operation, intervene immediately if something goes wrong, and keep records of what was observed. Monitoring can be completed by anyone working at a site, even someone undertaking the activity being monitored, so long as they understand what they're looking for and what records they need to keep. While monitoring may sound like a new requirement for facilities, there are existing monitoring requirements under SCAS. The requirements for daily inspections of livestock and record keeping in SCAS are in the SCAS Animal Welfare Standard number 14. SCAS also requires the meeting of the same targets to be monitored under LGAP as SCAS Standards 1, 15 and 20. So facilities genuinely complying with SCAS do not see any substantial changes to operations required to meet LGAP monitoring requirements. So under LGAP, there are 5 activities that require monitoring and records to be kept. The first one we will look at relates to unloading and loading of animals from trucks. Notably, importers, feedlots and abattoirs will be required to monitor this as they receive or send livestock. Importers in particular need to monitor when loading trucks at the wharf when animals arrive into a country. The remaining monitoring requirements relate to abattoirs. So the first requirement is to monitor when livestock are moved from lairage into restraint. The next applies to abattoirs that handle cattle and is about monitoring from the time the restraint takes hold until stunning or slaughter takes place. The last 2 monitoring requirements only apply to sites or abattoirs that use stunning, and they're to monitor for the effectiveness of the stun and whether or not the animals remain unconscious until death. Before we take a look at each monitoring requirement in detail, I wanted to point out that monitoring is conducted by watching a sample size of animals being handled, not every single animal. The sample size is calculated on the average daily total of animals received or processed, as shown in the table. For example, if a feedlot is receiving an average of 200 animals a day, monitoring would have to be done on a sample size of 25. This would apply to both unloading and loading occurring each day. As monitoring is designed to ensure good practices are being followed and identify any problems arising, monitoring records should also include any actions taken to fix problems that are identified as part of the monitoring activity. Sites need to monitor and keep records to verify the sampling rates have been met, that the measurement of the performance of the actual activity and targets is being met, and show corrective actions when they haven't been. Let's now look at the monitoring requirements for loading and unloading livestock onto or off of trucks. So every site that sends or receives livestock must monitor animals during loading and unloading. The targets to be monitored are for ensuring that animals are loaded safely and without injury. The targets are to ensure that 1% or less of animals fall, 3% or less of animals slip, and 3% or less of cattle vocalize. If the targets for falls, slipping, and vocalization are exceeded, action must be taken to immediately fix the cause. Targets being exceeded could be due to damaged or worn infrastructure or inadequate training of personnel, or it could be due to a unique situation on the day. It is important to keep a record of the monitoring carried out and the action taken to determine whether or not these targets have been met. The monitoring noted for abattoirs depends on whether or not they use stunning or if they're handling cattle. The first targets to be monitored are when livestock are moved from lairage into restraint, and this is at all abattoirs. The targets are the same for unloading and loading as they are for moving from lairage into restraint. So 1% or less of animals fall, 3% or less of animals slip, and 3% or less of cattle vocalize. If the targets are being exceeded, action must be taken to immediately fix the cause. The second target to be monitored are when cattle are restrained for stunning or slaughter. And that's all about making sure that 5% or less of cattle vocalize from the time the restraint takes hold. If the target for vocalizing when in restraint is exceeded, action must be taken immediately to fix the cause. The same targets apply in that if you had 200 animals you were processing, you'd need to watch a minimum of 25. The last two requirements are around abattoirs that use stunning. So when animals are stunned, monitoring needs to be carried out to ensure that stunning is effective, with at least 95% of animals being effectively stunned on the first application of the stun device. If the target for effective stunning is not met, action must be taken immediately to fix the cause. When animals are stunned, monitoring should be carried out to ensure that all of those animals, so 100% of animals, remain stunned until slaughter or until death is confirmed. If the target for unconsciousness until death is not met, action must be taken to immediately fix the cause. As noted, LGAP and SCAS require records of monitoring to be kept. The LGAP management system manuals provide templates for use by facilities, including a template to assist sites keep records on monitoring activities. LGAP does not prescribe the form of records a site must keep. It's up to each individual site, but we have created templates to use if you want to use them. Monitoring records must be kept, and they will be viewed by both internal and external auditors. The monitoring undertaken by the site forms part of the records and evidence that external and internal auditors will look at as part of their audits. This also includes looking at any non-conformities identified and the corrections or corrective actions that have been undertaken as a result of monitoring. The next section we'll talk about is section 7, and it relates to management systems. Management system requirements are outlined in LGAP 1002. Many sites will already have procedures in place which will form part of the LGAP management system. We will highlight the key requirements, documents, and records required in an LGAP management system. To start off, let's explain what a management system is. A management system is a collection of all your procedures, work instructions, and documents that instruct personnel how to do their job. It also contains procedures on what checks management will do to ensure procedures are being followed and how to fix issues when they occur. It also includes all the records you keep, such as livestock receivable records, transport documents, livestock inspections, and monitoring records. You might hear the terminology documented information used within LGAP. Documented information means anything that is written down or recorded. This might be procedures, work instructions, forms, and records that are made and kept as part of your everyday operations. Under SCAS, you will already have procedures or instructions in place which you can utilise as part of your management system. The LGAP management system requirements build on these procedures, so you can use what you have in place already. ANIMARC has prepared a template management system manual, which contains template procedures and records that you can use to implement LGAP in combination with your existing procedures. We have also prepared a tool that you can use to see what documents you might need from the management system manual and what documents you already have in place to conduct sort of a gap analysis. Establishing a management system is the biggest difference between SCAS and LGAP. A management system is having procedures in place that address the leadership and responsibilities of each site. So it's basically about writing down who does what and who's responsible for doing what at your site. It requires you to document all your processes, risks, and monitoring activities. And that's associated with the actual activities that you're doing on site, how you go about them. It also requires document control. And this is a procedure that explains how you manage your records and procedures and keep them controlled and update them and make them available to people who need them. For example, if you update a procedure, how do you communicate that to the staff to make sure they have access to the newest version? It also requires a procedure on management review, and this is a procedure about how the management team will review the operation and the management system annually to make sure everything's happening properly. Internal audits is a procedure that's also required and details the who, what, when, and how internal audits will be conducted. Non-conformities and corrective actions is the last piece of the management system, and that's all about how you will correct any non-conformities that are found. Because some of these areas are new, ANIMARC has developed templates for you that you can use in combination with your existing procedures. So these are generic procedures that you can amend and change to suit your operation, but the basic information is there for you to implement. So let's discuss briefly around processes and risks. Processes are the activities you perform and include things like making sure equipment and infrastructure is working, such as maintenance. It could also mean things such as receiving livestock and unloading them from trucks and putting them into holding pens. Caring for livestock while they're on site, such as feeding them, watering them, checking them for identification, making sure they're not ill or injured. It could also be things such as restraining livestock, stunning livestock, or slaughtering livestock. And you could also have a process around training personnel. So for each of these processes or activities that you perform, you should have instructions written down and available to the people who need to follow the instructions. So in writing the steps down, you need to consider what absolutely must be done each and every time to ensure animal welfare or traceability is achieved. This is called identifying and controlling risks. An example of this might be that you could check the unloading ramp before you use it. Now, as you go through and start unloading, the risk of livestock slipping and falling is minimized or eliminated because you've checked the ramp to make sure it's suitable before you've used it. The end result in documenting a process, all the risks and controls that you need to do, is called a procedure. And at the core of the management system are all your procedures and the records that come out of procedures. So we just talked that a process is the risks and controls and steps that you follow to make sure an activity is completed. And they should also include who's responsible for doing the procedures or who's responsible for performing the procedures and oversight of that activity, as well as what records are to be kept in relation to that procedure or activity. So the goal is to ensure that each activity is carried out in the same way each time to achieve the same or similar outcome. Another way to put it is that procedures need to be followed to make sure that animal welfare and traceability outcomes are met. Now, if something does not go to plan, that's okay. Having a management system based on continual improvement allows you to fix issues when they happen to make sure they don't happen again. This is why it's called a non-conformity process, not a non-compliance. And you have a non-conformity procedure, which helps you identify the cause of why something happened and fix it so it doesn't happen again. Records are also important, as making and keeping records of activities proves that the procedure was followed. It gives you some evidence. For example, you might have a procedure in place about how to unload livestock from trucks. This might require a record to be made of incoming livestock, and then that's checked against the transport documents. Following this procedure helps ensure that the welfare and traceability outcomes are met during unloading. The last thing I want to talk about here in terms of procedures is verification. So verification is checking that the procedure is being followed, the records are being made properly, and the overall procedure is adequate to achieve conformance or the outcomes of animal welfare and traceability. Verification is what internal auditors do to check on conformity, and it is a very useful tool to identify any issues with your procedures before they're identified by an external auditor. Verification is a key component to what's called continual improvement. Now, continual improvement includes things such as internal audits, management review, and managing non-conformities. You can also identify things in continual improvement in your everyday operations without it being under these three areas. Basically, it's anything to do with checking and making improvements to your operation. Continual improvement doesn't mean there's anything incorrect within your system. It just means there might be a more efficient or cost-effective way to do something. As part of your management system, you'll need a procedure in place on how you perform internal audits, management reviews, and manage non-conformities. So these are the three topics that we talked about earlier in the management system as being three things that you need as a documented procedure. As an overview, internal audits are to be conducted using the ANIMARC conformance system, and the frequency of these are determined by your risk rating. You need a competent internal auditor to conduct the internal audit to make sure that procedures are in place and that they're being followed. The internal auditor also has to verify that daily monitoring data is met and actions are being taken if targets are exceeded. Internal audit results are to be reported to management, and the results and corrective actions recorded in the ANIMARC conformance system. Non-conformities and corrective actions are also managed and recorded in the ANIMARC conformance system and should be addressed without delay. If a non-conformity is issued, you need to determine the cause of the issue and then implement a fix that addresses the cause of that issue. This should then be verified or checked to make sure the fix has worked properly. To give you an example, imagine we're thinking about our unloading ramp before. So our unloading ramp is broken and it's causing livestock to fall. Fixing the ramp doesn't address the cause of why the ramp broke in the first place. So not only do you need to fix or correct the ramp to make it safe to use in the immediate short term, but you need to make sure that the ramp gets inspected and repaired more frequently than it is currently to fix the cause of why it broke in the first place. And to tie it all together is the management review. So a management review is an annual review of the management system by the management team. And the idea here is to look at the entire system, all the procedures, all the personnel, all the records, all the audit results, and find any areas of improvement based on the performance and resources. So updates of the management system can happen daily, or they can happen annually, or they can happen as a result of internal audits or external audits. It's appropriate to do it whenever it suits the management system. Animark has also developed a template for you to use to help to conduct management reviews as well, so you can implement that into your business and management system without too much hassle. Our final section today is on the requirements of LGAP 1003, which is the requirements for operator chain of custody. As we saw in the beginning of today's session, only importers and exporters must adhere to the requirements in LGAP 1003 chain of custody. However, specific requirements within LGAP 1001 and 1002 apply to facilities and directly link with the requirements for traceability under 1003. So it's important that everyone in LGAP maintains traceability of livestock, that is, keeping incoming and outgoing records, to help importers and exporters conform with LGAP. There are two themes to LGAP 1003. The first is chain of custody and the second is traceability. They might sound the same, but they're actually a little bit different. So chain of custody refers to control over where livestock are being sent and processed, while traceability refers to documentation and the ability to locate animals at any point in time. The four key elements of chain of custody that enable control, the control of livestock movements, is to ensure that livestock are only sent to and received by operators and facilities that are certified to LGAP. And this includes maintaining records and contractual agreements with supply chain partners to ensure that they remain within LGAP. Operators also have to comply with all relevant local laws and regulations in relation to their livestock. This includes records or copies of permits, licenses, and things like that. Next, operators have to assess risks in their supply chains, plan for contingencies, and take action to ensure animals can be redirected to alternative LGAP certified sites if required. This includes maintaining plans and agreements for emergencies, and it could have to do with what happens if one of your facilities becomes suspended or withdrawn, or it burns down, as an example. What are you going to do with the livestock intended to go to that facility or livestock on site at that facility? The final piece is to conform with LGAP 1002, which is to have a management system. So how are you going to trace animals? How are you going to verify your traceability data? How are you going to reconcile consignments? The last piece to chain of custody and traceability is around verifiable traceability of animals through supply chains. So verifiable traceability means that all animals through the supply chain have to be traced until death. And that means that they have to ensure records of livestock movement are kept to ensure and locate those animals. Under SCAS, there are four principles: animal welfare, independent auditing and traceability and control of livestock through the supply chain. Exporters are obliged to comply with the requirements specified under each principle of SCAS. The chain of custody standard under LGAP brings together the animal welfare, traceability and control principles under SCAS in order to ensure exporters' regulatory requirements continue to be met. LGAP, however, takes a more holistic approach to control and traceability and places auditable requirements on all parts of the supply chain, which contribute to control and traceability. LGAP formalises the control and traceability obligations on importers that are implied under SCAS. Exporters and importers must use and maintain a system that verifies where all of the animals through their supply chain are until death. This is achieved through various interfaces and reporting systems with facilities. As I mentioned before, feedlots and abattoirs have obligations under 1001 and 1002 that feed into verifiable traceability requirements. The requirements of the chain of custody standard are most likely already being met by operators and facilities with control and traceability systems in place. LGAP makes the obligations on all parties through the supply chain clearer and defines what facilities need to do as well as what operators need to do in order to achieve conformity. So that brings us to the end of the specific requirements around sites, facilities, importers and exporters must meet in order to conform with LGAP. I'm going to now briefly touch on the possible next steps for facilities and the resources available to assist in conforming with LGAP. The process of certification starts by applying. This is done by completing an application on the ANIMARC website. You'll be asked to complete a self-assessment questionnaire to help identify any areas that you may need to undertake in order to get ready for your internal and external audit. Once you've applied, you'll be given access to the ANIMARC conformance system and can undertake your first internal audit. We've also prepared paper versions of the internal audit checklist that have been translated into different languages to help in-market participants complete internal audits. We have some other training around internal auditors and internal audit requirements, because internal audits are a key part of completing LGAP certification. Internal auditors are appointed at the time of application, remembering they can be a staff member or from an external party. They need to be competent and trained and independent of the work that they've been doing. So they can't audit their own work, and they cannot be someone from a certification body or an approved auditor. Internal auditors will need access to the ANIMARC conformance system in order to complete and submit internal audits. And then once that internal audit is completed, the first external audit can be undertaken and the certification journey can continue. ANIMARC is always here to provide you with resources and assistance if you need it. There will be links and resources relating to this session and all other sessions made available on our website. ANIMARC has a manual for feedlots and abattoirs, which provides a range of templates you can use to build your management system. This also exists for importers and exporters as well. We also have guidance manuals that are specific to feedlots, specific to abattoirs, importers and exporters as well, which pull all the requirements from all of the standards together into a specific guidance manual. All of this guidance is also included in the ANIMARC conformance system for you to use when you undertake your internal audits. We've also developed some summary documentation, a gap analysis, and some just general resources, which are all available, some of them translated into different languages, which are available on our ANIMARC website. So in today's training session, we've outlined the key requirements that operators and facilities must meet in order to conform with LGAP. Operators and facilities need to have documented procedures, also called a management system, which instructs personnel on how to manage animals and achieve traceability. These procedures are supported by having competent personnel, suitable equipment and infrastructure, and keeping records relating to inspections, monitoring, and traceability. When combined, all these requirements mean you're able to meet the outcomes of animal welfare and traceability, which are the two of the foundational elements of LGAP. So that brings us to an end of today's session. Thank you for watching, and we hope you've answered your questions. Remember that there are further training sessions available on the LGAP standards, the ANIMARC conformance system, and LGAP generally if you wish to use and watch those videos.